What kind of man mocks a legend to his face and thinks he'll walk away unscathed? Stephen Colbert, with his smug grin and sharp tongue, thought he could take a swing at Clint Eastwood's legacy and not feel the sting. On the set of Stephen's late-night show, with a live audience buzzing like a hive ready to swarm, the stage was set for a showdown that would leave jaws on the floor. Clint, the man who'd stared down outlaws on screen and built a career on grit, wasn't there to play nice. He'd agreed to the interview to talk about his latest film, a gritty war drama that poured his heart into every frame. But Stephen, hungry for laughs and headlines, had other plans. He'd spent weeks hyping the episode, dropping hints about grilling the icon, as if Clint was some rookie who'd crumble under a few cheap shots. The crowd roared as Clint stepped onto the set, his weathered face like a map of hard-won battles, his eyes narrow and unyielding. Stephen, leaning back in his chair, tossed out a greeting laced with venom. "So, Clint, still making movies about tough guys at your age? Don't you ever get tired of playing the same old cowboy?" The audience tittered, sensing the jab, but Clint's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. He'd heard the whispers before, critics calling his work outdated, saying he was stuck in the past. But to hear it from Stephen, a man who'd built his empire on snark and never risked a thing, felt like a knife in the gut. "You think you know tough, Stephen?" Clint growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You sit behind that desk, tossing out jokes like they're bullets. Try standing in the line of fire for real." Stephen didn't flinch. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief, ready to twist the knife. "Oh, come on, Clint. Your films are like museum pieces. Same old hero, same old fights. Don't you think the world's moved on?" The crowd gasped, a mix of shock and thrill, as the air thickened with tension. Clint's stare could have burned a hole through steel, but Stephen kept pushing, his voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, your new movie, what's it called? Echoes of Valor. Sounds like another excuse to wave a flag and shoot something." The audience shifted, uneasy, as Clint leaned closer, his voice a quiet storm. "You want to talk about valor, son? You wouldn't know it if it slapped you across that smug face of yours." The set felt like a powder keg, every word a spark. Stephen, sensing the crowd's unease, tried to pivot with a laugh, but it came out forced, brittle. All right, let's not get too serious," he said, waving a hand. But Clint wasn't done. He'd come to talk about a film that honored soldiers, men and women he'd met while researching, whose stories of sacrifice kept him awake at night. Stephen's mockery wasn't just an attack on him. It was a slap at everyone who'd inspired the movie. "You think it's a game, Stephen?" Clint said, his voice rising, each word a hammer. "You think those stories are just props for your little comedy routine?" The audience held its breath, caught between awe and dread, as Clint's anger filled the room like smoke. Stephen's smile faltered, but he doubled down, unwilling to lose face. "I'm just saying, Clint, maybe it's time for something new. You're not the only voice out there." Clint's chair scraped back, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. He stood, towering over the desk, his presence commanding every eye in the room. "You want to talk about voices?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've spent 60 years giving a voice to people who don't get one. What have you done, Stephen, besides tear down folks braver than you'll ever be?" The crowd erupted, some cheering, others whispering as Stephen's face reddened. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but Clint's glare stopped him cold. The argument was no longer a segment. It was personal, raw, and unstoppable, and it was only just beginning. Clint Eastwood stood like a monument, his shadow stretching across the polished floor of Stephen's set, his eyes locked on the host like a hawk on prey. The audience, still reeling from his last words, felt the air grow heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Stephen, caught off guard by Clint's towering presence, scrambled to regain control. He pushed back his chair, standing, to meet Clint's gaze, though his shorter frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Stephen snapped, his voice sharp but unsteady. "Just because you've got a few statues on your shelf doesn't mean you get to lecture me on my own show." The crowd murmured, some nodding, in support of Stephen, others glaring at his audacity. Clint's lips twitched, not in a smile but in something colder, more dangerous. "This ain't about trophies, Stephen," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It's about respect, something you wouldn't recognize if it was nailed to your desk." He took a step closer, the space between them crackling with hostility. Stephen's mockery of echoes of valor had cut deep, dismissing not just Clint's work, but the real soldiers whose lives inspired it. Clint had spent months with veterans, listening to their stories of loss and courage, pouring their truth into his film. To hear Stephen reduce it to a punchline was like spitting on their graves. Stephen, sensing the crowd's divided loyalty, leaned into his role as the provocateur. "Respect?" he said, his tone mocking, almost a sneer. "You're out here, making the same movie over and over, Clint. Heroes, guns, flags, give it a rest. The world's tired of your one-note song." A few audience members clapped, egging him on, but others gasped, shocked at the venom in his words. Clint's hands clenched, knuckles white, but he didn't swing. Not yet. Instead, he leaned over the desk, his voice low and cutting. "You ever met a soldier, Stephen? Looked one in the eye, heard what they've been through? Or do you just sit here, safe in your bubble, making fun of what you can't understand?" The crowd's noise swelled, a mix of cheers and boos, as the argument teetered on the edge of chaos. Stephen's face flushed, his confidence cracking under Clint's relentless stare. He tried to pivot, tossing out a jab to lighten the mood. "Come on, Clint, it's just entertainment. You make movies, I make jokes. We're not curing cancer here." But the quip landed flat, the audience sensing the desperation behind it. Clint shook his head, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You call it entertainment. I call it cowardice. You tear down what others build because it's easy. Try building something yourself. See how it feels when someone spits on it." Stephen's eyes narrowed, his pride stung. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance, his voice rising to match Clint's intensity. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Riding in here like it's the Wild West, telling me how to do my job. This is my stage, Clint. You don't get to play sheriff here." The audience erupted, some shouting for Stephen to back off, others urging Clint to stand his ground. A woman in the front row clutched her purse, her eyes wide, as if expecting a brawl. Clint didn't budge, his presence like a wall Stephen couldn't climb. "Your stage?" Clint said, his voice a quiet blade. "You're just a guest in the world those soldiers built. You'd do well to remember that." The tension was a living thing now, coiling around the room, ready to snap. Stephen, realizing he was losing the crowd, gestured wildly, his voice shrill. "You're out of touch, Clint. You're living in a world that doesn't exist anymore." But Clint's silence was louder, his stare unyielding, as if daring Stephen to keep digging his own grave. The segment was supposed to end, the producers signaling frantically from off stage, but neither man backed down. The crowd was on its feet, some shouting Clint's name, others hurling insults at Stephen. The argument had become a battlefield, and neither was ready to surrender. The studio vibrated with the crowd's energy, a restless sea of voices clashing like waves against a cliff. Clint Eastwood stood rooted, his eyes boring into Stephen Colbert, who paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his composure fraying. The host's last jab, calling Clint out of touch, hung in the air, a challenge that demanded an answer. Stephen, emboldened by the cheers of his loyal fans, pressed his advantage, his voice sharp as a whip. "You talk about respect, Clint, but you're the one stuck in the past, churning out films nobody asked for. You think you're speaking for soldiers? Maybe they're tired of you speaking for them." The words landed like a slap, and a ripple of shock ran through the audience, some hissing, others shouting in protest. Clint's face was stone, but his eyes burned with a fire that made the room feel small. He took a slow step forward, his boots heavy on the stage, each movement deliberate, like a man who'd faced down worse than a loudmouth host. "You don't get to speak for them either, Stephen," he said, his voice steady but laced with venom. "I've sat with men who lost brothers, mothers who buried their kids. You think you can sum that up with a smirk and a one-liner?" The crowd roared, a surge of support for Clint, their cheers drowning out the few who still backed Stephen. A man in the back stood, clapping fiercely, his face red with emotion, as if Clint's words had struck a personal chord. Stephen's smile was gone now, replaced by a scowl that betrayed his rattled nerves. He jabbed a finger at Clint, his voice rising to a near shout. "Don't come here acting like a saint. Your movies glorify war, turn pain into box office gold. You're not honoring anyone, you're cashing in." The accusation was a low blow, and the audience gasped, the air thick with disbelief. Clint's hands twitched, as if fighting the urge to grab Stephen by the collar. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice a low growl that carried more weight than any shout. "You think I do this for money? Every frame of that film is for the ones who came home broken, the ones you'll never know. You're the one cashing in, Stephen, selling their stories for cheap laughs." The crowd was a powder keg now, some chanting Clint's name, others hurling insults at Stephen, who seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. His producer, off stage, waved frantically, mouthing, "Cut to commercial." But Stephen ignored her, his pride chaining him to the fight. He stepped closer to Clint, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, spare me the sermon, Clint. You're not some noble storyteller. You're a relic, and the world's passing you by." The words were meant to wound, but they only fueled Clint's fire. He straightened, his presence filling the stage like a storm cloud. "A relic?" he said, his tone icy. "I've lived more truth in one day than you'll find in a lifetime behind that desk." The audience erupted again, their voices a chaotic mix of support and outrage. A woman near the front stood shouting, "Tell him, Clint!" while another yelled at Stephen to sit down. The set felt like it might collapse under the weight of the moment, every eye glued to the two men locked in a battle of wills. Stephen, his face flushed with anger, tried to pivot, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "You're making a scene, Clint. This is a talk show, not a saloon brawl." But Clint wasn't playing along. He pointed at Stephen, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You started this, Stephen. You wanted a fight. You got one. But you don't get to rewrite what I stand for." The standoff was electric, the crowd feeding off every word, every gesture. Stephen's confidence was crumbling, his usual charm useless against Clint's raw conviction. The host opened his mouth, searching for a comeback, but the weight of Clint's words seemed to choke him. The segment was spiraling out of control, and the audience knew it. They were witnessing something raw, something real, a collision of two worlds that couldn't coexist. And as Clint held his ground, unyielding, the room braced for what came next. Stephen Colbert stood frozen, his mouth open but no words coming, as Clint Eastwood's last accusation hung like a storm cloud over the stage. The crowd was a roaring tide, their voices crashing in waves of support for Clint and disdain for Stephen, who looked like a man caught in a trap of his own making. The host's eyes darted to the audience, searching for allies, but even his loyal fans seemed to waver, their cheers drowned out by the growing chant of Clint's name. Stephen's producer, now practically leaping off stage, signaled for a break, but the host waved her off, his pride a chain he couldn't break. He turned back to Clint, his voice sharp but shaky, like a man trying to shout down a hurricane. "You think you can come here and bully me? This is my show, Clint. I ask the questions, not you." Clint didn't move, his stance solid as oak, his eyes cutting through Stephen's bravado. "You call that a question?" he said, his voice calm but heavy with contempt. You're not asking anything. You're just tearing down what you don't understand because it makes you feel big." The audience erupted, a surge of applause shaking the room as a man in the third row pumped his fist, shouting, "Give it to him, Clint!" Stephen's face twisted, his confidence unraveling like a cheap suit. He stepped closer, his finger jabbing the air. "You're the one who doesn't get it. You make these big, loud movies, but they're empty. No depth, no heart, just noise." The words were a desperate swing, and they missed. Clint's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "No heart? I've held hands with widows who lost everything. I've listened to soldiers who can't sleep without seeing blood. That's the heart you're too blind to see." The crowd's roar was deafening now, a wall of sound that seemed to push Stephen back. He stumbled over his words, his usual wit failing him, as Clint pressed forward, his presence overwhelming. "You sit there, Stephen, judging what you've never lived. You think your jokes make you brave? They just make you small." Stephen's face burned red, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. He tried to rally, his voice rising in a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. "You're not some hero, Clint. You're just an old man yelling at the world to stay the same." But the crowd wasn't having it. Boos rained down, sharp and unrelenting, as a woman in the back stood, pointing at Stephen. "Shame on you," she yelled, her voice thick with emotion. Others joined her, their anger a living thing, feeding off Clint's unyielding strength. Stephen's eyes widened, realizing he was losing not just the argument, but the room itself. Clint took another step, his voice steady, each word a hammer striking steel. "I don't yell to keep things the same. I tell stories to keep them alive. Stories of people who fought, bled, died, so folks like you can sit there and make your jokes." The audience was on its feet now, a sea of faces lit with admiration. For Clint, their cheers a thunderclap that shook the set. Stephen tried to interrupt, his voice shrill. "You're twisting this. I'm just doing my job." But Clint cut him off, his tone final, unyielding. "Your job? Your job is to lift people up, not tear them down. You forgot that, Stephen. And that's why you're standing there alone." The stage felt like a battlefield, the air thick with the weight of Clint's words. Stephen's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under the crowd's relentless support for Clint. The producer, now visibly panicked, rushed to the edge of the stage, but it was too late. The argument had become a reckoning, and Clint was its unyielding force. The audience, swept up in the moment, waited for Stephen's next move, but his silence spoke louder than any comeback could. The clash was reaching its peak, and Clint's truth was winning. The studio was a cauldron of noise, the audience on its feet, their cheers for Clint Eastwood rolling like thunder across the stage. Stephen Colbert stood behind his desk, his face pale, his hands gripping the wood as if it could anchor him against the storm he'd unleashed. Clint's last words, calling him out for tearing down what others built, had stripped away Stephen's defenses, leaving him exposed before a crowd that had turned against him. The host's eyes flickered to the audience, searching for a lifeline, but the sea of faces stared back with disapproval, their loyalty now firmly with the man who'd stood up for something bigger than himself. Clint, unmovable as a mountain, kept his gaze locked on Stephen, his silence more powerful than any shout. The weight of his presence filled the room, a testament to a life spent telling stories that mattered. He didn't need to raise his voice. His truth had already won. "You had a chance to do something real tonight," Clint said, his voice, low but clear, cutting through the crowd's roar. "You could have asked about the people behind my film, the ones who inspired it. Instead, you chose to mock them. That's on you." The audience erupted again, their applause a wave that crashed over Stephen, who looked like a man watching his world crumble. Stephen opened his mouth, grasping for a comeback, but his voice faltered, the usual sharpness gone. "I didn't mean..." he started, but the words died under the crowd's boos, sharp and unforgiving. A man in the front row stood, his voice booming. "You owe him an apology!" Others joined in, their shouts blending into a chant that echoed off the walls. Stephen's producer, now at the stage's edge, threw up her hands, helpless to stop the chaos. Stephen raised a hand, trying to quiet the crowd, but it was no use. The room belonged to Clint now, and everyone knew it. Clint took a step back, not in retreat, but in finality, his eyes never leaving Stephen. "I came here to talk about courage," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of years. "Not mine, but the people I've met, the ones who don't get a stage like this. You had a chance to honor them, Stephen. You let them down." The crowd's roar swelled, a tide of agreement, as a woman in the middle row wiped her eyes, moved by Clint's words. Stephen's shoulders sagged, his defiance gone, replaced by a flicker of shame. He looked at Clint, then at the audience, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. The chanting faded, replaced by a standing ovation that shook the room, every clap a salute to Clint's unwavering stand. He gave a slow nod to the crowd, his face softened by their support, then turned to walk off the stage, his boots echoing in the sudden hush. Stephen stood alone, the spotlight harsh on his face, as the audience's cheers followed Clint into the wings. The host tried to speak, to pivot to a commercial, but his voice was lost in the moment's wait. The show was over, and so was his attempt to diminish a legend. As Clint disappeared backstage, the crowd kept clapping, their voices a chorus of respect for a man who'd fought for something real. Stephen sank into his chair, his head bowed, the silence around him louder than any joke he'd ever told. The argument had ended, not with a brawl, but with a truth so clear it left no room for doubt. Clint Eastwood had walked onto Stephen's stage and walked off a victor, his legacy untouched, his voice stronger than ever. The audience, still buzzing with awe, knew they'd witnessed something unforgettable. A moment where honor triumphed over mockery, and a legend stood taller than ever.